Hello, my name is Christina Järv-Ekström. Happy to be here talking to the director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. And today the reason we are talking is that we are particularly happy about an occasion that occurred recently, and that is the fact that the government announced that the new Swedish National Human Rights Institute will be placed in Lund. And why is that of such great interest, Morten?
Of course, we are very pleased here in Lund we'll be able to create a strong human rights environment, having, of course, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute in Lund, having the very strong university, a lot of faculties dealing with different aspects of the human rights, good, vibrant civil society, and not least that the Lund is the first human rights city in Sweden. So there are many good reasons to welcoming the National Human Rights Institution into this environment.
And Lund is also very close to Copenhagen, where you have been leading the Danish National Human Rights Institution for many years. You've been the director of that institution, and you were also the chairman of the European Committee in charge of these national human rights institutions. So you have vast experience from these institutions.
Yeah, no, that's of course, I was very pleased to see Lund, but also mentioning the Danish Institute for Human Rights, sort of embracing that as part of the human rights environment in the region. So,
and since you have such great experience from these institutions and from the inside, I guess you can also tell me a little bit about what a national human rights institution is, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the journey of the national institution started. Say back in 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in the UN, and where the discussion started, so okay, what do we then do to translate the nice words in the declaration into realities on the ground in states? And a number of states said, well, let's create some sort of national focal point, national institution, and very much with the hidden agenda, or it's quite obvious, I think, was to avoid that we would get the international machinery, that there would be a national, international monitoring system. So it was used of, well, we should deal with this at home and not have international scrutiny. As we all know, we got the treaty bodies, we got the mechanisms that are now working today, and a very important part of the whole monitoring system. Compliance system of human rights. So, and when that materialized, some of these states lost a bit interest in talking about national institutions. But then it came again on the agenda in the wake of the democratization process after the end of the Cold War, 1989, 1990, where a lot of states said, well, we sort of have now created a democratic system, multi-party systems, and we have the procedures in place. But democracy is much more than only the procedures regarding how we make decisions in our society. What are the value? What is the framework? And there, of course, obviously, human rights came in, but also the discussion of what are there institutions that can look into how we translate human rights into realities in our communities. So there again, the national human rights institutions were put on the agenda, and in 1991, the UN convened an expert meeting in Paris, which then drafted the so-called, what ended up to be the Paris Principles that we still use today, that creates the framework of what it means to be a national human rights institution, sort of the criteria. 2 years later, at the UN or the World Conference on Human Rights, again one of these landmark conferences right after the end of the Cold War, a very rich plan of action, the existence or the push to make states establish national human rights institutions were put forward. So you had there in the first years of the 1990s, a strong push for this. So we were 5 institutions, and I was so fortunate that I was heading one of the 5 institutions back then. Today, there are more than 100 across all continents. and we created sort of say the accreditation system. We created the international committee that gives the accreditation, and I was so fortunate to chair that committee for a number of years. And in those early days where you really create sort of the thinking and the system. And for the UN, it was a breakthrough, because back then the UN was states first and foremost, and then civil society. And suddenly these institutions came in, the national human rights institutions, saying we are third category. And they were sort of shaking their head and said they didn't really understand it. But we sort of insisted and said, no, we are not a state body, but we are not neither a civil society organization. We are sort of in between here, or something in our own right. So we also want to speak and act in our own right. And that is fully accepted today, but it took a lot of battles. And that is a long, very interesting story in itself.
But so, yeah, you mentioned the mandate and what kind of organization it really is. But so what is it going to do?
But a national institution is there to look into human rights in the country. So it's not, it doesn't sort of say look at the human rights in all other countries, like sort of that sort of approach that we know from, for example, the Amnesty International mandate. But it looks internally and it gives advice. It's an advisory body to the government, to the institutions, municipalities, regions, on how to implement the international standards. And so therefore, in that advisory role, it's extremely important that it's independent. So in the Paris Principle, it's underscored that it should be independent, meaning that it should not take orders from any governmental structures. Because if it takes orders from a governmental structure, I mean, how can you then trust the advice? Well, I don't want you to advise me in this direction. You should advise me in another direction that I like better. I mean, that doesn't work. So that independence is very important. Secondly, it's very important that it has a broad mandate, that it's not sort of narrow, only looking at one or two human rights, gender equality, racial discrimination, but it has the broad mandate of all human rights. It should be well anchored in society. So it should have a pluralistic composition, meaning that civil society should be engaged in the organization, in the governing structures in one way or another, the disability organization, the religious communities, the race, ethnic minorities, and basically mirroring the plurality of our societies, in order to get a sense of what are the issues, what is it that we should address, where is it, what is it that we don't see if we belong to sort of the mainstream population, what happens in the fringes of our societies. That's normally where the human rights violations occur, or where human rights are not fully protected. And that's where the national institution should be. The national institution should have the possibility to give its opinion on draft legislation, to ensure that the legislation is in conformity with the international standards. I mean, instead of the government passing legislation and then violations take place and you have to go to court and to the international machinery afterwards, after it has taken place, then it's more preventive. You look into the legislation to see, is this in conformity with the international standards, and then give advice. Normally it will not, does not have the power to cancel and say the government should, but it is sort of in that advisory role. So in the legislative process, it has a key role to play. And then, of course, looking into disability issues, accessibility issues, how is that integrated in the work of municipalities, in the legal system, access to courts, court buildings, etc., etc. So there are lots and lots of issues that the Swedish citizen will sort of say, hopefully see in the everyday life as well when the institution is up and running. So it's very exciting that that we are getting this institution, and having worked with these institutions now for 30 years, I must say that they have played an enormous role in securing and protecting and promoting human rights in very many states. But it takes that it's been given that frame, it's given, so to say, the freedom to act, and then of course not only the freedom to act and point to the problems, but also that there's someone then to address the problem and take it serious.
And as a Lund citizen, I'm really looking forward to what's going to happen, and Lund municipality getting some new and good advice on human rights. But thank you, Morten Kjærum, for shedding light on this interesting phenomena that we are looking forward to what's going to happen now soon during the year. And I think it would be operational already by the start of 2022, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think that's the roadmap. Thank you, Christina.
Thank you very much, and thank you for listening. And if you're interested in reading more about national human rights institutions, check out the links below on the Paris Principles and more. Thank you so much again, and see you soon.